Soot gritted in his throat, a dry abrasion that refused to be swallowed. Elias Thorne pressed a gloved palm against the warehouse wall, the rough, damp bricks scraping the wool of his mittens as he leaned his weight into the masonry. The fog did not merely sit upon Wapping, it chewed the district, grinding the bituminous coal smoke from 1,000 hearths into a yellow paste that coated the tongue and strung the eyes until they watered uselessly. He shifted his footing, the sole of his boot slipping on a patch of river slime that had crept up from the Thames during the low tide, bringing with it the brine of rotting kelp and the sour, stagnant breath of the sewer mouths. 58 years of hunching over ledges had curved his spine into a permanent question mark, a physical bowing to the weight of ink and candlelight that now made the walk home feel like a pilgrimage through mud. He wanted only the dry warmth of his study, the specific comfort of a glass of port that tasted of oak and dust, and the silence of a room where no one bled. "Keep back, sir." The voice cracked, high and thin, cutting through the muffled clatter of the street. Thorne stopped. He blinked, trying to clear the grease from his lashes, and found his path blocked not by a cart or a stray dog, but by a wall of men. Dockworkers mostly, their faces obscured by scarves and the grime of the day's labor, stood shoulder to shoulder in a tight, shivering arc. They did not push. They did not shout the usual insults reserved for a clerk who walked with a cane and wore powder in his hair long after the fashion had died. They stood still as tombstones. "Let me pass," Thorne said, his own voice sounding reedy, swallowed instantly by the damp air. "I reside on the next street." "No one passes," a man muttered, shifting his weight but not turning. The smell of stale yeast and unwashed bodies rolled off the group, thick and animal. "Not there, not tonight." Thorne squinted past the broad back of a man whose coat was stiff with salt spray. Beyond the cluster of workers, the familiar outline of the Marr household loomed, but the windows were wrong, dark. No candlelight flickered behind the muslin curtains where Mrs. Marr usually sat to mend socks until midnight. The door, usually latched but never barred against the neighborhood, stood slightly ajar, a black slit in the facade of the building. "What has happened?" Thorne asked, stepping closer, the toe of his boot bumping against the heel of the nearest worker. "Is it fire?" The man turned then, just enough for Thorne to see the white rim of his eye, wide and unblinking. "Worse," he whispered, the word dropping like a stone into a well. "Best you walk on, master, best you don't look." But the silence drew him. It was not the absence of noise, for the Thames still groaned against the pilings, and a distant ship's bell told the hour through the wool of the fog. This was a vacuum, a sucking quiet that seemed to emanate from the shop itself, pulling the sound out of the air. Thorne felt a prickle of cold sweat break across his scalp beneath his powdered wig, a sensation of being watched by something that did not breathe. He needed to know. The clerk in him, the man who had spent decades categorizing debts and deaths in neat columns, rebelled against the unordered mystery of that open door. He sidestepped the worker, ducking under an arm that moved too slowly to stop him. "Madness," someone hissed behind him. "He's mad." Thorne crossed the threshold. The air inside was colder than the street, a stillness that hit the face like a physical blow. The scent struck firster a sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood that cut through the usual smells of tea, sugar, and coal dust, so potent it made his stomach convulse. He fumbled for the tinderbox on the counter, his fingers trembling as they struck flint against steel. A spark caught the wick of a tallow candle, flaring into a weak, yellow flame that struggled to push back the shadows. The light revealed the shop, but it did not explain it. Everything was in its place. The bolts of muslin stood stacked in precise towers. The jars of loose tea sat aligned on the shelves, yet the floor told a different story. A trail of dark, wet prints led from the door towards the parlor, the mud mixed with something darker, something that glistened in the candlelight. Thorne moved forward, his cane tapping softly on the floorboards, the sound absurdly loud in the dead room. He told himself he would turn back, that he was an old man with weak lungs and no business in a slaughterhouse, but his feet carried him towards the parlor door. He pushed it open. 3 figures lay on the floor. They were arranged with a terrible geometric precision that made Thorne's breath hitch in his chest. Mr. Marr lay near the fireplace, his head twisted at an angle that suggested the neck had snapped like dry kindling. Beside him, the apprentice lay curled, his hands clutching at his throat, as if trying to hold the life inside. And further back, near the window, Mrs. Marr sat slumped against the wainscoting, her eyes open and staring at nothing, a pool of blood spreading beneath her skirts like spilled ink. There was no struggle, no overturned chairs, no signs of a frantic fight for survival. The room looked as though they had simply sat down to die, or perhaps as though death had entered and asked them to pose before it took them. The violence was absolute, yet the scene possessed a stillness that felt staged, a tableau of domestic ruin curated by a hand that valued composition over chaos. Thorne reached out, his gloved finger hovering inches from the sleeve of Mrs. Marr's dress. He did not touch her. To touch her would be to admit the finality of it, to break the fragile illusion that they might yet draw breath. The cold slickness of the river mist seemed to have followed him inside, settling on his skin like a shroud, chilling the sweat on his brow. He could hear his own heart, a dull thudding against his ribs, but it sounded distant, as if the blood within him had already begun to slow in sympathy with the three still forms on the floor. The candle flame guttered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for the corners of the room, hiding whatever else might be waiting in the dark. He stood frozen, a witness to a silence so complete it felt like a verdict, knowing that the order of his world, built on ledgers and laws, had just been erased by a single, brutal stroke. Thorne lowered his hand. The glove remained clean. He had not touched her. To bridge that gap between the living and the dead required a permission he did not possess, a sacrament reserved for priests or kin, neither of which applied to a retired clerk with weak lungs and a cane. He turned, the motion stiff, mechanical, as if his joints had filled with the same cold grease that coated the river pilings. The candle on the counter sputtered, wax pooling over the brass holder, and he blew it out before leaving the shop. Darkness felt more honest than the yellow lie of that flame. He stepped back into the street. The fog grabbed him. It clung to his wool coat, dampening the fabric until it weighed double, pressing against his ribs like a wet palm. The group of dockworkers had not moved. They stood in the same rigid formation, boots scuffed against the cobbles, waiting for a verdict only he could deliver. Faces turned towards him, pale discs in the gloom. Expectation hung off them, heavy and ugly. They wanted gore. They wanted details they could carve into shape at the pub later, something to warm the blood against the December bite. Thorne tightened his grip on the cane handle. The wood was smooth, worn down by years of nervous friction. Well, the voice came from the left, rough with tobacco and impatience. A man with a scarred jaw leaned forward, breaking the line. Is it true? Thorne adjusted his wig, the pins dug into his scalp. True what? That the whole lot is gone. The man spat, a dark globule landing near Thorne's boot, before adding that his brother claims to have heard the mallet, insisting the noise ceased just before midnight. Noise travels. As Thorne shifted his weight to favor his left leg, the damp seeped through the sole of his shoe, cold and immediate. Best you ask the magistrate. We are asking you. Another voice, higher, tighter, a younger lad, barely 16, eyes wide and rimmed with red. You went inside, you saw. Thorne looked at the boy. He saw the tremor in the kid's hands, the way he clutched his own elbows as if holding himself together. Fear smelled sharp, like vinegar cutting through the coal smoke. It was easier to lie. The truth would sit in their stomachs like lead, rotting the night's sleep from them forever. But a lie would spread, mutate, become something worse than the blood on the floorboards. Go home, Thorne said, his voice lacking authority as it sounded thin and reedy against the river's groan. There is nothing for you here. Did you see them? The scarred man stepped closer, invading the space Thorne needed to breathe. Was it the sailor, Williams? They say he owed Ma money. I saw nothing. Thorne pushed past him. The shoulder check was deliberate, a breach of etiquette he would not have tolerated 10 years ago, but the rules of the magistrate's court did not apply to the edge of the grave. Move. The crowd parted. Grumbling rippled through them, a low tide of dissatisfaction. They wanted a spectacle, a named villain, a story with a beginning and an end. Thorne offered them only a closed mouth and a retreating back. He walked, the cobbles slick underfoot, uneven, threatening to twist an ankle with every step. He did not look back. To look back would be to invite the scene to follow him, to let the image of Mrs. Mar's open eyes attach itself to his own vision like a burr. He focused on the ground. The mud here was different, thicker, mixed with the runoff from the tanneries upriver. It held a chemical tang that burned the back of the throat. He passed a cart abandoned near the corner, wheels sunk deep into the muck. A single sack of coffee beans split open beside it. The beans lay scattered, dark stones amongst the filth. No one had claimed them. In this city, property mattered less than survival, and tonight's survival meant staying indoors, barring the shutters, praying the fog kept the violence contained to the neighbors. Thorne stopped, leaning against a brick wall where the rough texture scratched his wool sleeve, while his breath escaped in short, white plumes that vanished instantly into the mist. He closed his eyes, yet the image of the parlor remained behind his lids, burned into the retina with geometric precision and a terrifying lack of struggle. A clerk knows order. He knows where things belong, so ledgers align and quills rest in inkwells, but bodies do not arrange themselves by the fireplace like furniture moved for a gathering. Something was wrong, not just the killing. The killing was brute fact, a common enough tragedy in the rookeries of London. It was the composition. He pushed off the wall. The movement sent a spike of pain through his lower back, a reminder of his age, his fragility. He needed the warmth of his own study, a glass of brandy, the smell of old paper that did not smell of copper. He turned the corner towards his lodgings, the cane tapping a rhythmic code against the stone. Tap, drag, tap, drag. The street narrowed here, the buildings leaning in until the sky was a slit of grey above. Shadows pooled in the doorways, deeper than the fog warranted. Thorne quickened his pace. The sound of the Thames grew louder, a heavy, slapping rhythm against the embankment, water hitting wood, water hitting stone. He paused at the intersection. Beneath the roar of the tide, beneath the distant shout of a watchman calling the hour, another sound surfaced. Faint, intermittent, a dull, wet thud, like a heavy object striking bone. Thorne froze, his hand tightening on the cane until the knuckles whitened beneath the glove. He turned his head, straining to isolate the noise from the wind. It came from the direction of the highway, echoing through the brick canyons of Wapping. Zumbu. Silencer. Zumbu. It was not the ship. It was not the crowd. It was the memory of the room projecting itself onto the street, a ghost noise generated by the shock still vibrating in his marrow. Or perhaps it was real. Perhaps the killer still walked the fog, carrying the tool of his trade, looking for the next house where the candle burned too late. Thorne gripped the cane harder. The wood creaked under the pressure. He began to walk again, faster now, the rhythm of his steps trying to drown out the phantom beat, but the sound persisted, keeping time with his heart, a mallet striking bone in the dark. The door to the magistrate's office did not close so much as it surrendered to the pressure of the crowd outside, a low groan of hinges protesting the weight of the city pressing in. Inside, the air hung thick and stagnant, a soup of bituminous coal smoke, the sour tang of unwashed wool, and the sharp, coppery ghost of blood that seemed to have followed Thorne in from the street, clinging to his coat tails like a persistent beggar. He sat on a hard wooden bench near the back, knees drawn up slightly to accommodate the stiffness in his joints, watching the chaos unfold with the detached weariness of a man who has spent 40 years cataloguing other people's disasters. "Tell me again," Magistrate Harford barked, slamming a palm onto the desk that sent a cloud of dust dancing in the single shaft of candlelight. "Did you see the face or not?" "I told you," the dockhand stammered, twisting his cap in hands blackened by tar and grime. "It was dark, fog thick as soup. I heard the noise, that's all, like a sack of wet flour hitting the floor." "A sack of flour," Harford repeated, his voice dripping with a sarcasm that barely masked his desperation, before he snapped. "And the other witness?" He demanded to know about the woman from the Chandlers. "She said a tall man," another clerk interjected, scratching a quill across parchment with a sound like a rat gnawing on bone. "Said he wore a sailor's jacket, blue, faded." "Sailor's jacket," Harford muttered, rubbing his temples with fingers that trembled slightly. "Half the men in Wapping wear a sailor's jacket. It tells us nothing. It tells us less than nothing." Thorne shifted his weight, the wood of the bench creaking under his slight frame. He watched the magistrates, men of law and order suddenly rendered impotent by the sheer absence of tools to grasp the intangible. They had no lenses to magnify a fingerprint, no chemicals to reveal the invisible, no way to freeze the fleeting shadow of a suspect other than the flawed, trembling memory of a frightened witness. They were trying to catch smoke with a sieve, and the frustration radiating from the desk was a physical heat, warming the chill that had settled in Thorne's bones since he left the Marr house. "It could be Williams," someone muttered from the corner, a voice low and conspiratorial. "John Williams, the sailor, he was seen near the ship pub an hour before." Williams, Harford seized on the name like a drowning man grabbing a rope, demanding it be written down with Williams at the top, before asking if anyone had seen him leave. The room erupted then, a cacophony of conflicting assertions, half-heard rumors, and drunken speculations that collided and shattered against the walls. Thorne closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the noise wash over him, a tidal wave of ignorance masquerading as evidence. They were building a narrative out of mist and fear, constructing a culprit to satisfy the hunger of the mob rather than to uncover the truth. The 7 dead in the Marr house did not need a story, they needed justice. But justice, Thorne knew with a sinking clarity, required facts, and facts were the one commodity this city was currently bankrupt of. He opened his eyes. The candle on the desk sputtered, the flame dipping low as a draft snaked through the cracks in the window frame. The shadows on the wall lengthened, stretching and contorting until the magistrates looked like giants looming over the tiny, terrified dockhand. "Get him out of here," Harford ordered, waving a hand dismissively, for they had enough. "Send word to the constables. Look for Williams and bring him in." The dockhand was ushered out, shuffling feet and bowed head, replaced instantly by another eager to offer his own worthless testimony. Thorne stood. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if rising from deep water. His legs felt heavy, the blood sluggish in his veins. He could not stay. The air in here was becoming unbreathable, saturated with the stench of panic and the metallic taste of a rush to judgment that felt uncomfortably like a second murder. He moved towards the door, keeping his head down, avoiding the gaze of the clerks who might ask him to stay, to corroborate, to lend his retired authority to their flimsy construction. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the office fading slightly behind him, replaced by the damp, cold silence of the corridor. Outside, the night had deepened as the fog rolled in heavier, swallowing the gas lamps until they were nothing more than bruised purple smudges hovering in the gloom. Thorne pulled his coat tighter around his thin frame, the wool damp and clammy against his skin. He began to walk, his cane tapping a rhythmic, solitary beat against the wet cobbles. Tap, drag, then tap and drag again. The sound was too loud in the empty street, a metronome marking the passage of a man who wanted only to escape the memory of geometric death. He turned the corner onto Ratcliffe Highway, expecting solitude, expecting the respectful distance the living usually afford the dead. Instead, he found a carnival. A crowd had gathered near the cordon, a dense mass of bodies pressing against the invisible line where the horror lived. They were not mourning. There were no bowed heads, no whispered prayers for the souls of the departed. Their faces were upturned, illuminated by the flickering light of torches held by the few constables trying to hold the line, and in their eyes, Thorne saw a glint that made his stomach turn. It was curiosity, pure, unadulterated, grotesque curiosity. "Did you see it?" a woman asked, her voice cutting through the murmur. She held a child on her hip, the boy's eyes wide and fixed on the darkened windows of the Marr house. "My brother says the blood went all the way to the ceiling." "Rubbish," a man next to her scoffed, leaning forward as if he could see through the brickwork. He insisted it was the mallet, delivering one clean blow like chopping wood. They spoke of the slaughter as if discussing the price of fish or the quality of the tide. The tragedy had already been consumed, digested, and repackaged into entertainment for the long winter nights. Thorne stopped beneath a flickering gas lamp, the light casting his own long, wavering shadow across the faces of the Gawkers. He reached up and wiped the river mist from his spectacles, the cloth coming away damp and grey. Through the cleared lens, the scene sharpened, becoming even more horrific in its clarity. These people were not afraid, they were enthralled. The violence had not repelled them, it had drawn them in, magnetized by the spectacle of blood on the cobbles. It mirrored the killer's own brutality, this hunger, to strip the humanity from the dead and turn them into a show. Thorne felt a surge of nausea, a physical revulsion that had nothing to do with the smell of the river. He turned away from the crowd, seeking the darker recesses of the alley, needing to put distance between himself and this new, terrifying manifestation of the crime. As he moved towards the docks, the crowd's murmur shifted, coalescing into a specific thread of conversation that drifted towards him on the damp air. Saw him near the stairs. Dark past, they say. Sailor Williams. Thorne paused, his hand tightening on the cane. The rumor was spreading faster than the fog, a whisper network weaving a net around a man who might be guilty, or might simply be the next sacrifice to the city's insatiable need for a conclusion. He listened, straining against the wind, as the name floated again, sharper this time, carrying the weight of an accusation that felt dangerously close to a verdict. The word tore through the fog, raw and ragged, stripped of grammar by sheer panic. It was not a command but a spasm, a sound ripped from a throat that had forgotten how to form polite requests. Thorne stopped. The cane tip skidded on a patch of slime, green algae blooming on the wet stone, and for a heartbeat he teetered, a thin stick figure against the bruised purple smear of a gas lamp. He did not fall. He righted himself, the motion stiff, joints clicking like dry twigs snapping under a boot heel. "Which way?" Thorne shouted back, his voice cracking, the reedy tone of a man used to whispering in courtrooms, now forced to compete with the rising tide of hysteria. The runner, a boy no older than 12 with a cap pulled low over ears red from the cold, did not look back. He scrambled over a pile of discarded oyster shells, the crunch loud and sickeningly organic in the damp air, and vanished into the grey curtain of mist that choked the alley mouth. Thorne stood alone in the sudden vacuum of sound, the boy's departure leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. The air tasted different now. The usual cocktail of coal smoke and brine had shifted, curdled by a new sharp tang that coated the back of the throat. Copper, warm and distinct. It cut through the yeast-stale breath of the docks, a metallic signature that required no translation. He turned towards the highway. The street, usually an artery of commerce even at this hour, had become a throat closing around a bone. Figures poured from the tenements, doors banging against brick, the sounds sharp and violent in the stillness. They were not running away, they were running towards. Thorne moved against the flow, a salmon fighting a current of wool coats and petticoats, his shoulder checking against rough fabric, his cane raising like a weapon to clear a path. "Make way," he muttered, the words lost instantly in the roar of the gathering. "Let me through." A woman grabbed his sleeve, her fingers digging into the damp wool of his coat to leave a smear of soot on the black fabric. "Did they get him? Is it the sailor?" Her eyes were wide, the whites reflecting the torchlight flickering from the direction of the Williamson house, yet there was no fear in them, only a starving intensity. "Tell me, sir, you look like a gentleman. Did they catch the beast?" "I know nothing," Thorne said, twisting his arm free. The fabric stretched, then snapped back. He stepped around her, his boots splashing in a puddle that reflected the chaotic dance of shadows. "Move, please." "He's in the shop," a man yelled from the rooftop of a chandler's store, leaning precariously over the gutter. "Doors barred from the inside. No, waiter smashed to kindling." The crowd surged forward, a single organism driven by a pulse of morbid curiosity that drowned out any instinct for self-preservation. Thorne felt the pressure against his back, a physical weight pushing him towards the source of the alarm. He stumbled, caught himself on a brick wall, the rough texture scraping the palm of his glove. He did not pull away. He needed the friction, the anchor of the solid earth to keep from being swept into the crush of bodies that threatened to trample him into the cobbles. The smell grew stronger. It was no longer just the suggestion of copper. It was the thick, cloying scent of a slaughterhouse floor left too long in the sun, masked poorly by the damp fog. It clung to the moisture in the air, settling on his eyelashes, coating his tongue. 10 yards, 20. The Williamson household loomed out of the grey, a dark mouth waiting to swallow them all. The windows, usually dark at this hour, glowed with a frantic, wavering light. Candles had been lit in every room, their flames dancing wildly as drafts whipped through the shattered entryway. Thorne pushed past a constable who was trying to hold a line with nothing but a raised hand and a desperate expression. The officer's face was pale, sweat beading on his upper lip despite the chill, his uniform coat unbuttoned and flapping open. "Back," the constable croaked, his voice breaking. "By order of the magistrate, back." "Open the door," someone screamed from the front rank. "Let us see." Thorne squeezed through the gap where the constable's arm faltered, slipping into the relative quiet of the shop's interior. The noise of the mob dulled instantly, muffled by the brickwork, replaced by a silence that felt engineered, heavy and suffocating. It was the same silence he had known 12 days prior in the Marr house, a silence that did not belong to the living. Inside, the scene was a grotesque mirror of the previous tragedy. The shop floor, usually swept clean for the morning trade, was slick with a dark, viscous fluid that caught the candlelight and threw it back in jagged shards. Muslin bolts, stacked neatly on the counter only hours before, lay unrolled and sodden, the white fabric stained a deep, impossible crimson that seemed to pulse in the flickering light. Thorne stopped near the doorway, his breath hitching in his chest. He did not look at the bodies huddled in the corner, shrouded partially by a fallen curtain. He could not. To look would be to acknowledge the finality of it, to admit that the terror had not ended, but had merely paused to reload. "Mr. Thorne." The voice was low, trembling. A young constable, barely more than a boy himself, stood near the counter, holding a lantern that shook in his grip. The light swung wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the ceiling like grasping fingers. "We found this near the threshold." Thorne forced his eyes away from the corner, focusing instead on the floor where the constable pointed. There, lying amidst the debris of splintered wood and shattered pottery, lay a mallet. It was a heavy thing, crafted for work, not war. The handle was worn smooth by the grip of a laborer's hand, stained with oil and sweat, but the head was dark, wet. A clot of hair and tissue adhered to the iron face, glistening fresh in the lantern light. "God save us," the constable whispered, crossing himself with a hand that smelled of tobacco and fear. "It's the same. It's the very same tool." Thorne stepped closer, the urge to recall warring with the clerk's ingrained need to catalogue, to witness. He crouched, ignoring the protest of his knees, and examined the weapon. It was ordinary, that was the horror of it. There was no devilish craftsmanship, no mark of a monster. It was a tool found in any dockside shed, any ship's hold, any carpenter's apron. A thing of utility turned into an instrument of apocalypse. He reached out, his gloved finger hovering inches from the stained iron, but he did not touch it. To touch it would be to claim a connection he did not want, to implicate himself in the narrative the mob was already weaving outside. "Bag it," Thorne said, his voice sounding hollow, stripped of emotion. "Do not let them see it." "They already know," the constable replied, his eyes fixed on the mallet with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. "The word is out. They say it's Williams. They say he's holed up in the alley." Thorne stood up, the movement draining the last of his strength. The damp wool of his coat felt suddenly immense, a leaden shroud dragging at his shoulders. He looked from the mallet to the shrouded forms in the corner, then to the door where the muffled roar of the crowd continued to batter against the walls. The connection was made. The circle closed. 2 houses, 2 families, 7 souls extinguished by the same blunt instrument, and now the city would demand a head to match the tool. "Bag it," Thorne repeated, turning his back on the scene, "before the blood dries." He walked towards the door, stepping carefully over the slick patches on the floor, avoiding the gaze of the dead. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the gas lamps whole, leaving the street in a twilight gloom where faces were indistinguishable from masks. The crowd parted for him, sensing the authority in his stride, or perhaps the sheer exhaustion that radiated from him like heat. He stepped onto the cobbles, the cold mist settling instantly on his skin, seeping through his clothes to chill the bone. The mallet was gone now, wrapped in coarse linen and carried away by the constable, a tangible piece of evidence that promised justice. But as Thorne pulled his coat tighter, feeling the damp wool cling to his ribs like a second skin, he knew the promise was a lie. The weapon was real, yes. The blood was real. But the killer was not in the alley, and he was not in the crowd. He was somewhere in the spaces between, woven into the very fabric of the neighborhood, watching the spectacle he had created with the same hungry eyes as the rest of them. Thorne began to walk, the cane tapping a solitary, rhythmic beat against the stones, a sound that seemed to echo the falling of a hammer long after the blow had been struck. The fog did not lift. It settled, a wet wool blanket pressing down on the Ratcliffe Highway, smelling of low-tide brine and the acrid bite of coal smoke that clung to the back of the throat. Thorne moved through it, a grey ghost in a greyer world, his cane finding the slick cobbles by feel rather than sight. He wanted only to reach the corner, to turn left, to find the dry sanctuary of his study where the ledger books waited with their orderly columns of debt and credit. Instead, his feet carried him towards the noise. The alarm had broken the dawn, a jagged tear in the quiet that drew people from their beds like moths to a fatal flame. "Make way!" A constable shoved past, his tricorn hat askew, face flushed a deep, unhealthy red beneath the grime. He did not look at Thorne. No one looked at anyone anymore. Eyes were fixed on the destination, on the house where the silence had returned. Thorne stumbled, his boots slipping on a patch of mud mixed with something darker, viscous and cold. He righted himself, gripping the iron railing of a neighboring fence, the metal biting into his palm through the glove. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark save for a single, frantic candle flickering in the upper sash, casting a wavering jaundice against the mist. It was the Williamson home, the second violation. Thorne pushed through the knot of onlookers near the door, ignoring the muttered curses, the elbows digging into his ribs. "Magistrate's clerk," he rasped, the title feeling like ash in his mouth. "Let me pass." The constable at the threshold hesitated, then stepped aside, his expression one of vacant horror. Inside, the air changed. The chaotic roar of the street vanished, severed by the brickwork, replaced by a stillness so absolute it pressed against the eardrums. It was the same silence as the Marr house, a held breath, a paused heart. Thorne stopped just inside the foyer, his hand instinctively going to the button of his coat, needing to loosen the constricting wool, but lacking the will to move his fingers. The shop floor stretched before him, a tableau of ruin. Bolts of muslin, pristine white only hours ago, lay unrolled in the dirt, soaking up the spillage. The fabric was no longer white. It was a deep, sodden crimson, heavy and clinging to the floorboards like a second skin. Candlelight from a makeshift candelabra on the counter fought a losing battle against the gloom, throwing long, distorted shadows that danced across the ceiling, mimicking the shapes of things that should not be there. Thorne kept his gaze lowered, fixed on the pattern of the wood grain, refusing to let his eyes drift to the corner where a fallen curtain draped over a mound of stillness. To look would be to make it real, to acknowledge that the terror had not been a singular event, a freak of nature, but a recurring sickness. "Mr. Thorne." The voice came from the floor. A young constable, his face pale as tallow, crouched near the threshold. He held a lantern low, the flame guttering in the draught, illuminating an object lying amidst the splintered debris of a shattered jar. Thorne forced his legs to move, stepping over a pool of liquid that reflected the candlelight in jagged shards. He stopped beside the boy. On the floor lay a mallet. It was a common tool, the kind used by dockhands to drive wedges or by carpenters to shape timber. The handle was oak, worn smooth and dark by years of sweat and oil, shaped perfectly to the grip of a working man's hand. But the head, the iron face was blackened, caked with a substance that glistened wetly in the lantern's glow. A tuft of hair, matted and dark, adhered to the metal, along with fragments of something softer, something that did not belong on a tool. "Found it," the constable whispered, his voice cracking. "Just inside the door, didn't have to look far." Thorne crouched, the joints of his knees protesting with a sharp click. He leaned closer, the smell hitting him thinner, not just blood, but the coppery tang of it mixed with the stale yeast of spilled ale and the sharp scent of fierce sweat. It was ordinary, that was the terror. There was no sigil, no mark of the devil, no intricate design suggesting a madman's artistry. It was a tool of trade, turned to a purpose it was never meant to serve. Any man could own such a thing. Any man walking the docks, any sailor sleeping in a boarding house, any neighbor sharing a wall. "Same as the others?" Thorne asked, though he knew the answer. He knew it in the way the blood had spattered, in the brutality of the blow that required such weight, such finality. "Aye," the constable said, crossing himself with a trembling hand. "Same iron, same wood. God help us, it's the same hand." Thorne reached out, his gloved finger stopping short of the stained metal. He did not touch it. To touch it would be to claim it, to bind himself to the evidence in a way that felt sacrilegious. This object was a vessel of death, a container for the violence that had erased 2 families in 12 days. It sat there, innocuous and deadly, linking the 2 scenes with a silent, brutal logic that no amount of words could explain. Outside, the crowd murmured, a low rumble like distant thunder, sensing that something had been found, something that would feed their hunger for a name. "Wrap it," Thorne said, his voice flat and stripped of inflection. "Linen, thick." "They're saying it's Williams," the constable said, not moving to obey. His eyes were wide, fixed on the mallet with a mix of revulsion and a terrible fascination. "Saw him near the stairs last night, drunk, talking to himself." "Wrap it," Thorne repeated, sharper this time, "before the crowd breaks down the door." The boy flinched, scrambling for a length of coarse cloth from his belt. He bundled the mallet quickly, tying the ends in a clumsy knot, hiding the stained iron from view. But the damage was done. The object was found. The link was forged. Thorne stood, the movement draining him, leaving his legs feeling like water. He looked towards the corner again despite his resolve. The curtain had shifted slightly, perhaps from a draft, revealing the edge of a shoe, small and still. A child's shoe. 7 souls. The number hung in the air, heavier than the fog. 7 lives extinguished by a piece of wood and iron, and now the city would demand a sacrifice to balance the scale. They would take Williams, or someone like him, and hang him high enough to satisfy the hunger, convincing themselves that the evil was contained in one man, one body, one noose. But Thorne knew better. He felt it in the chill that seeped through his boots, in the way the silence of the room seemed to watch him. The killer was not a monster from outside. He was here. He was in the rhythm of the streets, in the shadow of the warehouses, in the very air they breathed. "Take it to the magistrate," Thorne said, as he turned towards the door. "Do not stop. Do not speak to anyone." "And you, sir?" Thorne pushed open the door, stepping back into the suffocating embrace of the fog. The cold hit him like a physical blow, seeping through his coat, chilling the sweat on his brow. The crowd surged forward, a wave of bodies and desperate faces, but they parted before him, sensing the grim authority of his exhaustion. He walked away from the house, away from the silence, his cane tapping a solitary rhythm against the wet stones. Click, drag, click, drag. The sound echoed in the narrow street, a mocking imitation of the blow that had fallen inside. The mallet was gone, wrapped and hidden, a tangible proof that offered the illusion of closure. But as Thorne merged into the grey mist, feeling the damp wool cling to his ribs like a shroud, he knew the illusion for what it was. The weapon was real. The blood was real. But the hand that wielded it remained unseen, woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, watching the spectacle with the same hungry eyes as the rest of them. The cane struck a loose stone, sending it skittering into the gutter, the sound sharp and final, marking the end of one search and the beginning of a far darker hunt. Constable Hales hovered over the tool. His hand shook, a fine tremor that rattled the brass buttons on his cuff before he gripped the oak handle. The wood groaned under the pressure, a dry, protesting sound that echoed too loudly in the cramped shop. Blood had soaked into the grain, turning the pale timber the color of a bruised plum, dark and wet, where the iron head met the shaft. Hales lifted it. The weight dragged his arm down, pulling his shoulder into a slump, as if the iron possessed a gravity of its own, unrelated to mass. "Heavy," Hales said. "Dead weight," Thorne replied. He did not move closer. The distance between his boots and the constable's felt significant, a boundary line drawn in sawdust and spilled ale. Thorne watched the way the candlelight caught the smear on the iron face. It was not a clean strike. The metal was gouged, scratched by previous labor, now layered with the fresh ruin of bone and hair. A single strand of dark fiber clung to the edge, trembling slightly as Hales breathed. Human hair, from the boy or the master. Distinction mattered less than the fact of it. 7 souls gone. Now this object sat in the air, suspended between the floor and the evidence bag, bridging the gap between the Marr house and this room with a brutal, wooden logic. "They say he bought it near the docks," Hales whispered. He did not look at Thorne. His eyes remained fixed on the stained iron, wide and unblinking, as if the tool might bite. "Sailor, Williams, seen him drinking at the King's Arms since Tuesday." Rumor travels faster than the tide. Aye, but the mallet. Hales shifted his grip, fingers tightening until the knuckles whitened against the dark wood. Same as the Mar place, no doubt. Thorne stepped forward, the friction of his wool coat sounding like dry leaves scraping together. He leaned in, close enough to smell the scent rising from the weapon. It was not just blood. There was the sharp tang of old sweat from the handle, the oily reek of the iron, and beneath it, the sickly sweet odor of a room where life had been extinguished too quickly for the air to clear. The smell of a butcher's block left out in the sun. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, fingers digging into his own palms to keep them still. To touch the thing would be to validate it, to admit that a piece of trade equipment could erase a family. "Wrap it," Thorne said. "Linen, do not let the iron show. The magistrate will want to see her." "The magistrate will want to sleep," Thorne cut in. His voice lacked the authority of his old clerkship, replaced by a weary flatness that commanded obedience through exhaustion alone. "If you carry that through the street uncovered, you will have a riot before you reach the station. They will tear it from your hands. They will burn it, or themselves." Hales flinched. He nodded, a quick jerky motion, and signaled to the boy standing by the door. The lad scrambled forward, clutching a length of coarse cloth. He moved with the frantic energy of a trapped animal, desperate to be useful, desperate to leave. The cloth was grey, stiff with starch and old dust. He draped it over the mallet head first, careful not to brush the iron with his bare skin. His fingers fumbled with the corners, twisting the fabric into a clumsy shroud. "Tighter," Thorne said. The boy yanked the ends and the knot slipped. He tried again, his breath hitching in his throat, until the bundle held its shape, a lump of wood and death wrapped in grey. Hales took it from him, cradling the package against his chest as if it were an infant or a bomb. The visual symmetry struck Thorne then. 2 homes, 2 families, 1 tool. The city would demand a single throat to choke on this information. They would not accept ambiguity, nor would they accept that a mallet could exist without a master, that violence could float free like fog until it settled on the first convenient target. "Williams," Hales said again, testing the name. It sounded heavy in the room, adding weight to the bundle in his arms. "We have him by morning." "You have a tool," Thorne corrected. "Do not confuse the instrument for the hand." "Someone held it." "Someone always holds it." Thorne turned away. The movement made his head swim, the candlelight flaring behind his eyes before settling back into a dull glow. He walked towards the counter, running a gloved hand along the edge of the wood. Smooth, polished by years of transactions, now stained with the residue of the highway. "Take it, go out the back, avoid the main street. They're waiting out front. Then crawl through the cellar if you must." Thorne did not look back. He heard the shift of fabric, the scuff of Hales's boots as he turned to obey. The constable hesitated, the weight of the unsaid pressing against the silence. He wanted confirmation. He wanted Thorne to say that this was enough, that the mallet was the key that locked the door on the terror. Thorne gave him nothing. To offer comfort now would be a lie, and the city had swallowed enough lies in the last 12 days to choke a horse. "Go," Thorne said. Footsteps retreated. The floorboards creaked under the burden of the evidence, then fell silent as Hales reached the hallway. Thorne stood alone in the shop. The candle on the counter sputtered, the wick drowning in a pool of melted wax. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the floorboards like fingers reaching for the place where the mallet had lain. The spot was empty now, but the impression remained. A clean patch of dust, surrounded by the grime of the room, a ghost outline of the weapon. He could hear the crowd outside. They did not cheer. They murmured, a low, continuous vibration that seeped through the brickwork. They knew something had been found. They knew the shape of it. The news would be in the pubs before the constable reached the magistrate. By dawn, the name Williams would be carved into the air of Wapping, solid as the bricks of the warehouse. Thorne rested his hand on the counter. The wood was cold. Dampness rose from the floor, creeping up through the soles of his boots, settling in his bones. Justice was a commodity here, bought and sold like the muslin on the shelves, with the mallet serving as currency. Once it was logged and displayed, the debt would be considered paid, the 7 grav covered by the spectacle of a hanging. Thorne lifted his hand. The glove was clean. He had not touched the wood or the blood, yet he felt stained, marked by the proximity to a violence that refused to be contained by walls or laws. The door to the street remained closed. Beyond it, the fog waited. It did not care about mallets or magistrates. It would swallow the constable, the evidence, and the crowd alike, grinding them down into the grey pulp of the city's memory. Thorne turned towards the exit. His cane stood against the wall, ready. He reached for it, the wood familiar under his palm, a support for a man who had walked too long on legs that wished to buckle. The handle was smooth, worn by his own grip, not the blood of strangers. He would step out soon, he would walk the cobbles, he would let the crowd part before him. But for a moment he stood in the quiet of the shop, listening to the settling of the building. The house groaned, timber contracting in the cold. A sound like a breath held too long finally released. Thorne tightened his grip on the cane. The wood did not speak. It offered no answers. It only waited for the weight of his hand, ready to tap out the rhythm of a hunt that had no end. The door latch clicked, a sharp final sound. Thorne stepped out into the Throat of Wapping. Air thick with coal smoke, and the sour, yeasty reek of ale spilled from the nearby pubs hit him first, a physical weight pressing against his face, clogging the nostrils with the taste of burnt earth and stale fermentation. He pulled his collar up, the damp wool scratching his jaw, and immediately the crowd surged, a single organism shifting its mass to accommodate his emergence while denying him any true passage. Bodies pressed close, shoulders bruised ribs. The heat of them was offensive, a feverish radiance rising from hundreds of coats soaked in river mist, creating a microclimate of breath and sweat that smelled of fear disguised as hunger. "Have they got him?" A woman, face red from cold and gin, grabbed his sleeve. Her fingers were raw, the knuckles swollen, digging into the fabric of his coat with a desperation that sought to anchor herself to authority. "Let go," Thorne said. "Is it the sailor? They say it's the sailor." He twisted his arm, breaking her grip without looking at her face, and pushed forward. The movement required force, a shoving match against the press of chests that refused to yield an inch of ground. People wanted to see the blood on the cloth, wanted to verify the shape of the mallet through the eyes of the man who had carried it, but Thorne offered them nothing but the back of his powdered head and the stiff set of his shoulders. "He's in the cage," a man shouted from the rear, the voice cracking with excitement. "Williams, they've got John Williams." The name rippled through the gathering like a stone dropped in a stagnant pond, sending out waves of murmurs that quickly hardened into shouts. It was not a question anymore. It was a verdict delivered by the street, ratified by the sheer volume of voices demanding it to be true. Thorne stumbled as someone jostled him from behind, his boot slipping on a patch of wet cobble slick with horse dung and trampled mud. He caught himself on a brick wall, the rough texture scraping his palm, grounding him for a second before the current swept him onward. They were moving towards the magistrate's office, a tide of black hats and bonnets flowing down the narrow lane, dragging Thorne along in its undertow. He did not want to go. He wanted to retreat to the quiet of his study, to the ledger where numbers made sense and deaths were recorded in ink that did not smell of iron. But the crowd had its own momentum, a kinetic energy born of 12 days of sleeping with locked doors and listening for footsteps on the stair, and it would not allow him to dissent. "Make way!" A constable bellowed the command, his voice strained, trying to carve a path through the flesh of the street. He swung a truncheon, not striking anyone, but using the threat of it to clear a space around a central figure. Thorne saw him then. John Williams. The sailor was not walking so much as being carried, his feet barely touching the stones, suspended by the grip of two burly officers who held him under the arms. His head hung low, chin tucked into his chest, obscuring his face beneath the brim of a battered hat that looked too large for his skull. His coat was torn at the shoulder, the fabric gaping to reveal a shirt stained with something dark that might have been oil or might have been the dried blood of a stranger. He did not speak. He did not raise his hands to shield himself from the fists that occasionally shot out from the crowd to bruise his ribs or tug at his hair. "Murderer! Bastard! Hang him now!" The cries were distinct, sharp projectiles launched from the darkness of the alleyways, but they merged into a single roar that drowned out the distant tolling of a ship's bell. Thorne watched Williams flinch as a rock struck his leg, a dull thud that echoed even over the shouting, yet the sailor made no sound of pain. He simply swayed, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by the men holding him and the mob pushing against them. There was a terrible passivity to him, a collapse of the spirit that suggested he had already accepted the rope, or perhaps that he was too broken by whatever hell he had walked through to care about the stones being thrown. Thorne felt a nausea rising in his gut, unrelated to the smell of the docks. It was the sight of the magistrate's relief that sickened him. He could see them at the front, near the steps of the office, their faces illuminated by the flare of a torch held high. They looked lighter, unburdened. The net had caught something, and it did not matter to them if the fish was the right one, only that the net was full. The political stability of the East End depended on this body, this specific name, and they would weave the evidence to fit the man, just as a tailor alters a coat to hide a hunchback. "Clear the way," the lead constable shouted again, shoving a young boy aside with a brutality that made the child crumple without a cry. Thorne stopped. He let the crowd flow around him, eddying past his stationary form like water around a stone. He was an observer now, detached from the current, watching the procession drag Williams towards the cells. The sailor's eyes were visible for a second as he lifted his head, glazed and unfocused, reflecting the torchlight with a hollow vacancy that reminded Thorne of the fish gutted on the quayside, staring up at a sky they would never see again. It was too easy, the rush of it, the certainty. In the silence of the Mar house, there had been geometry, a precision of violence that spoke of a mind working with cold intent. Here, in the mud and the shouting, there was only chaos, a sloppy grasping for closure that felt indistinguishable from the panic that had seized the city 12 days prior. They were not solving a crime. They were performing an exorcism, casting the demon out of Wapping by binding it to a drunken sailor and locking him in the dark. Thorne turned away from the spectacle, unable to watch them take Williams inside because he knew exactly what would happen next. The doors would close and the keys would turn. The magistrates would write their reports, smoothing out the jagged edges of doubt until the narrative sat flat and acceptable on the page. The crowd would disperse, satisfied that the blood debt was paid, and tomorrow the shops would open, and the muslin would be sold, and the Severn Grave would be covered by the noise of commerce. He found an alleyway, narrow and reeking of urine, tucked between a chandler's shop and a boarded-up tavern. The shadows here were deep, untouched by the torchlight of the procession. He pressed his back against the cold brick, feeling the dampness seep through his coat, and listened to the roar of the mob fade into a muffled rumble as the office doors slammed shut. The sound of the lock engaging was distinct, even from this distance, a heavy clank of iron on iron, final, absolute. It sounded less like justice and more like a lid being nailed down on a box. Thorne closed his eyes, the image of Williams's vacant stare burning behind his lids, and knew with a sinking certainty that the investigation had ended before it had truly begun. The city had its victim. The truth would have to starve in the dark. The lock's clank hung in the air, an iron period at the end of a sentence nobody had finished writing. Thorne opened his eyes. The alley smelled of wet ash and the sour curdle of spilled gin, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like a phlegm one could not clear. He pushed off the brickwork, his shoulder blades scraping against the rough surface, and stepped back towards the street where the torchlight still danced in a frantic, dying rhythm. The crowd had not dispersed. It had only changed shape, coiling tighter around the magistrate's office now that the prey was caged, buzzing with the electric satisfaction of a hunt concluded. They were feeding on the closure, chewing it over with greedy tongues, already inventing the details of the capture to make the story richer, sharper, more sellable in the morning papers. "Did you see his face?" a woman shouted, her voice cracking with a hysteria that mimicked grief but tasted of entertainment. "Pale as milk, guilt writes itself on the skin, I say." "Liar," a man grunted nearby, spitting a wad of tobacco onto the cobbles with precise aim. He looked drunk, just drunk. "They're hanging a sailor because the tide went out." "Silence, you fool," the woman snapped, elbowing him hard enough to make him stumble. "The magistrates know, they have the mallet. Everyone knows about the mallet." Thorne moved through the gap their argument created, a ghost slipping between the living. He kept his head down, the brim of his hat shielding his eyes from the flaring torches that sputtered grease and smoke into the fog. The air here was thick, a soup of coal dust and body heat that made every breath feel like inhaling wool. He needed to move. Staying still meant being swallowed, becoming part of the chorus that would sing this tragedy into a ballad by week's end. His boots found purchase on the slick stones, navigating the refuse of the celebration. Crushed oranges, discarded handbills promising rewards, and the dark, wet stains of things better left unnamed. He turned the corner onto Ratcliffe Highway, where the press of bodies thinned just enough to let the cold river wind bite at his cheeks. The silence of the street was a shock after the roar of the mob, a sudden vacuum that pulled at his ears. Here, the shops stood shuttered, their windows dark eyes refusing to witness the aftermath. Only the Williamson house remained active, though not with life. A single candle flickered in an upper window, casting a long, wavering shadow across the brickwork that looked like a finger pointing accusingly at the ground. Thorne stopped. He could not help it. The pull of that house was a physical weight, a magnetism born of the terrible geometry he had seen inside. He walked towards it, his steps slowing as he approached the cordon of rope that still strained between two posts, marking the boundary of the sacred dead. A constable stood guard, leaning heavily on his staff, his eyes glazed with exhaustion and the cheap ale that passed for sustenance on a night like this. "Pass on," the constable muttered, not lifting his head. "Nothing to see, it's done." "Is it?" Thorne asked, his voice low, barely a whisper against the wind. The constable looked up then, squinting through the gloom. Recognition flickered, then died. "Clark, Thorne, you should be home. The bird is in the cage. Williams, they have him." "They have a man," Thorne corrected, the words tasting like ash. "Whether they have the killer is a matter for a court, not a mob." "Court?" the constable laughed, a dry, hacking sound that seemed to tear at his throat. "There won't be a court, not for this, because the king's peace needs restoring, Mr. Thorne, one way or another. When Williams hangs, the streets quiet down and we all sleep without listening for footsteps. That's the justice we can afford." He shifted his weight, blocking the path more firmly. "Go home, write your report, and let the dead rest." Thorne nodded, a stiff, mechanical motion. He turned away, the constable's words settling in his gut like a stone. The justice we can afford. It was a transaction then, a life for a sense of safety, a body for the silence of the shops. He walked on, his pace increasing as if he could outrun the logic of it, but the city offered no escape. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of Williams, hanging limp in the memory of the procession. Every echo of a footstep sounded like the drop of the trapdoor. He reached the corner where the road dipped towards the river, the smell of brine growing stronger, cutting through the coal smoke with a sharp, clean knife. The Thames lapped against the stairs, black and oily, indifferent to the 7 souls it had claimed indirectly through the terror of these 12 days. Thorne leaned against the parapet, gripping the cold stone until his knuckles turned white. Below, the water moved with a sluggish, heavy rhythm, carrying the flotsam of the city out to sea. A boat pushed off from the shadows near the stairs, a small skiff rowed by a single figure. The oars dipped silently, creating barely a ripple in the dark water. Thorne watched it, mesmerized by the solitude of the rower, the only person in London who seemed to be moving away from the spectacle rather than towards it. The figure paused mid-stroke, looking up at the highway where the torches still burned, a tiny, distant silhouette against the vast, swallowing dark of the river. Then the rower resumed, pulling hard, driving the boat towards the middle of the stream where the current ran fastest. Thorne straightened his coat, the damp wool heavy on his shoulders. He turned his back on the river and began the long walk towards Coldbath Fields. He had to see it. He had to witness the final turning of the key, the moment the world decided that the story was over. He walked with a heavy, dragging step, the cobblestones seeming to rise up to meet his boots, each one a reminder of the distance between the truth and the peace the city demanded. The fog thickened as he moved north, wrapping around him like a shroud, blurring the gas lamps into halos of sickly yellow that offered no warmth. Somewhere ahead, in the dark belly of the prison, a cell door would be bolted. A man would sit on a straw pallet, listening to the rats scratch in the walls, waiting for the morning or the end, whichever came first. And Thorne would be there, outside the bars, holding the silence that no amount of cheering could fill. The walk stretched out, endless and grey, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The image of the rower disappearing into the mist burned in his mind, a solitary figure escaping the net, while Thorne marched inexorably towards the place where the net had drawn tight, ready to watch the knot cinch shut. Cold bath fields rose out of the fog like a bad tooth, grey and swollen, against the low sky. Thorne stopped. He placed his palm flat against the outer wall. The stone bit back, a deep, marrow-chilling cold that seeped through the leather of his glove and settled into the bones of his hand, a sensation so sharp it nearly made him flinch, though he kept his face still, composed in the mask of the clerk who has seen too many ledgers balanced with blood. This was not the rough, soot-stained brick of Wapping, gritty with the residue of coal fires and river damp. This was dressed stone, smooth and unyielding, built to last longer than the men it swallowed. Above him, the upper windows were gone, swallowed whole by the thick, yellowish vapor that rolled off the nearby river and clung to the prison walls, obscuring the iron bars that surely waited behind the glassless frames. He could smell it here, distinct from the brine of the Thames or the yeast of the dockside ale. A sour, stagnant odor of unwashed bodies and despair, trapped within the perimeter and leaking out through the cracks in the masonry. "Mr. Thorne." The voice came from the shadow of the gatehouse, a man stepping forward with the cautious tread of someone who expects to be struck. It was a turnkey, his uniform coat too large, the buttons straining against a belly softened by too many meals stolen from the prisoners' bowls. He held a lantern low, the flame guttering in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows that made his face look like a shifting map of wrinkles and grease. "You've no business loitering," the turnkey said, though he did not reach for the truncheon at his belt. "Not this hour. The magistrates are gone, the press is gone, even the rats are settling down." "I only wished to see the place," Thorne said, his voice sounding thin as it was instantly swallowed by the heavy air. "The man inside, Williams." The turnkey shifted his weight, the hobnails of his boots scraping against the wet cobbles, a harsh, grating sound that set Thorne's teeth on edge. The man leaned in, the smell of stale tobacco and onions rolling off him, strong enough to mask the prison's stench for a heartbeat. "He's quiet," the turnkey whispered, dropping his voice so low Thorne had to lean forward to catch the words, a conspiratorial hush, as if the stone walls themselves had ears and would report the conversation to the governor. Quieter than a man should be, awaiting the king's justice. No praying, no ranting, just sitting. The turnkey paused, wiping his nose on a sleeve stained with mud. "Some say he's gone mad. Others say he's just waiting for the rope. But I tell you, Mr. Thorne, there's a silence in that cell that don't feel natural. It's heavy, like the air before a storm breaks, only it never breaks." Thorne felt a tightness in his chest, a physical compression that had nothing to do with the cold. "Has he spoken to anyone?" "Not a word since they locked him in yesterday," the turnkey replied, straightening up and pulling his coat tighter against the damp. "He sits on the edge of the cot, staring at the floor, speaking neither to the chaplain nor to me. You'd think a man innocent would shout, or that a man guilty would beg, but him, he's just empty." Glancing towards the gate before narrowing his eyes back at Thorne, the turnkey advised, "You should go home, sir. There's nothing to see here but a man waiting to die. While the crowd will be back at dawn, screaming for blood, tonight it's just him and the dark." Thorne nodded, a slow, mechanical dip of the chin. "Thank you." He turned away before the turnkey could say more, before the man could offer some further nugget of grim speculation that would only sour the already bitter taste in his mouth. The walk around the perimeter began, a slow circuit of the high walls that enclosed the misery within. His boots clicked on the wet stones, the sound muffled by the fog, each step echoing slightly before dying away, leaving him in a solitude that felt absolute. He passed a drain where black water oozed sluggishly towards the sewer, the surface slick with an oily film that caught the faint light of a distant street lamp. He did not look down. He kept his eyes on the wall, tracing the line of the mortar, imagining the cells behind it, the small, airless boxes where men rotted while the city slept or caroused or prayed. Inside one of those boxes, John Williams sat. Thorne tried to picture him, the sailor accused of butchering 2 families in the space of 12 days, a monster in the eyes of the mob, a convenient vessel for the city's terror. But the image would not hold. Instead, he saw the empty space, the vacuum of sound the turnkey had described. A silence heavier than the silence of the Marr household, where the dead lay arranged in their final, grotesque tableau. There the silence had been a consequence, the aftermath of violence. Here the silence was a presence, a living thing that filled the cell and pressed against the bars, waiting for the final act. He reached the corner of the building and stopped, leaning against the rough brickwork, the cold seeping through his coat now, settling into his shoulders, making him feel old, older than his 58 years, ancient with the weariness of a man who has witnessed the machinery of justice grinding without truth. The fog swirled around his ankles, cold and wet, clinging to his trousers like a second skin. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely, yipping sound that was quickly swallowed by the mist. He thought of the 7 dead. Mr. Marr, his throat opened, Mrs. Marr, the infant, the apprentice, the Williamsons, 7 lives extinguished, and now this man, Williams, waiting to join them in death, though by a different hand. Was it justice? The constable at the cordon had called it affordability, a transaction. Thorne closed his eyes, feeling the dampness on his lashes. He wanted to believe in the guilt of the man in the cell. He wanted to believe that the net had caught the right fish, that the horror had a name and a face and would soon be erased from the world. But the silence the turnkey spoke of gnawed at him, a small, persistent doubt that refused to be silenced by the roar of the mob or the certainty of the magistrates. He pushed off the wool and began the walk home. The streets were empty now, the spectators having retreated to their warm parlors to digest their ale and recount the sights of the day, turning blood into entertainment, tragedy into gossip. Thorne walked alone, his footsteps the only sound in the vast, sleeping city. He passed a shop window, dark and shuttered, the glass reflecting his own pale, gaunt face, a ghost drifting through the fog. He did not recognize himself. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper, the grey of his eyes duller, as if the light had been drained out of him along with the hope of a clean resolution. When he finally reached his own door, he fumbled with the key, his fingers stiff with cold. The lock clicked, a loud, sharp sound in the quiet street, and he stepped inside, closing the world out. The hallway was dark, the air still and cold, smelling of dust and old paper. He did not light a lamp. He walked straight to his study, pushing the door open with a shoulder that ached with a deep, bone-weary throb. The room was freezing. The fire had long since died, leaving only a bed of grey ash in the grate. He moved to the desk, running a hand over the surface, feeling the rough grain of the wood under his fingertips. He sat in the chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight, and stared at the blank page before him. He should write his report. He should finalize the notes, close the file, let the matter rest. But his hand remained still, resting on the paper, unable to pick up the quill. The silence of the room pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. It was not the peaceful quiet of a study at night, the comfortable hush of a man alone with his thoughts. It was the same silence he had felt outside the prison walls, the same heavy, waiting void that the turnkey had described. It filled the corners of the room, seeped into the cracks of the floorboards, settled on the shelves of books like dust. It was heavier than the silence of the murdered Holmes. Their death had been an event, a finality. Here, in the quiet of his own sanctuary, the silence felt like a prelude. He sat there, motionless, listening to the nothingness, waiting for a sound that did not come, unaware that miles away, in the cold belly of Coldbath Fields, the wait was already over. Then, from the distant city, a bell began to toll. The turnkey's whisper hung in the air longer than the man himself, a damp residue clinging to the wool of Thorne's coat, even after the heavy door had clanged shut. He stood with his palm flat against the wall, the stone leaching warmth from his skin, rough grit grinding into his fingerprint whorls. Coldbath Fields rose around him, a brick lung breathing out mist and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. "Move along, sir." The voice dropped from above, disembodied until Thorne tilted his head back to find a sentry's face obscured by the brim of a hat, musket barrel glinting dull grey against the fog. "Waiting for no one," Thorne said. His own voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the damp air. "Best not linger, bad luck. Luck has no purchase here." Thorne pushed away from the wall, the friction of his glove against brick sounding like a match strike in the quiet. He began the circuit. His boots found the rhythm of the place, a slow, dragging shuffle over cobbles slick with river slime and coal dust. Each step echoed, a hollow knock that returned to him distorted, as if the prison walls were mocking the solidity of his presence. To his left, the high barrier blocked the view of the cells, but the sound leaked through, not screams, not prayers. Just the low, constant murmur of men confined, a hive of desperation vibrating through the mortar. He stopped at a drain grate, black iron teeth set into the ground. Water oozed beneath, thick and sluggish, carrying the refuse of the institution out towards the Fleet ditch. The smell hit him then, distinct from the river Brinia, a cloying sweetness of decay masked by lime wash. He stepped over the stream, careful not to splash, though the hem of his coat dragged through the mud anyway. Stains spread upward, darkening the wool, a mark he would not notice until he sat in his study hours later. Another guard patrolled the far corner, hobnailed boots clattering with a sharp, aggressive cadence that differed from Thorne's own weary tread. The sound bounced off the brick, multiplying, creating the illusion of a crowd where only two men walked. Thorne paused, listening to the recursion. It reminded him of the Mar house. The silence there had been absolute, a vacuum sucked dry of life. Here the silence was manufactured, pressed down by weight of stone and law, yet it hummed with the potential for violence. "Keep moving," the distant guard called out, though not unkindly. "Nothing to see past the wall." "Seeing is not the purpose," Thorne muttered, more to the damp air than the man. He resumed walking. The fog thickened as he rounded the northern edge, swallowing the gas lamps until they were merely halos of sickly yellow suspended in the gloom. He trailed his hand along the brickwork, feeling the variations in the lay. Some sections were smooth, worn by decades of rain and touch. Others were rough, newer patches where repairs had been made hastily. His fingers caught on a protrusion, a loose fragment of mortar. He pressed it, testing the stability. It crumbled under his thumb, dusting his glove with grey powder. Inside, John Williams waited. The name felt heavy on his tongue, a stone he could not spit out. The magistrates wanted a conclusion. The mob wanted a hanging. The city wanted a story it could tell over supper to frighten the children and thrill the guests. Thorne wanted the truth, but the truth was a slippery thing, likely drowned in the Thames or buried under the floorboards of a shop in Ratcliffe. He stopped again, leaning his forehead against the cold brick. The chill seeped into his skull, dulling the ache behind his eyes. A shutter banged somewhere nearby, a sharp crack like a pistol shot. Thorne flinched, his hand dropping to his side. Just a house settling, just the wind. But his heart kicked against his ribs, a sudden, violent protest against the stillness. He stood there, breathing in the cold smoke, watching his own breath plume and vanish. "Who goes there?" The challenge came from the shadows ahead, a third guard emerging from the mist, hand resting on the truncheon at his belt. Thorne raised a hand, palm open. "Thorne, Elias Thorne." "Know the name, Clark." The guard stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he inspected Thorne's face, the powdered hair, the cut of the coat. "You're out late." "Late is relative when the dead don't sleep." The guard spat into the gutter, the sound wet and final. "Ain't no rest for the wicked, nor them that chase 'em. Move on, Mr. Thorne. Nothing changes behind these walls tonight." "Doesn't it?" "Man inside is done. Whether he breathes or not is just mechanics." Thorne looked past the guard, towards the dark mass of the prison. The windows were blank eyes, offering no glimpse of the interior. He imagined Williams in his cell, perhaps pacing, perhaps sitting still as a statue, waiting for the rope or the knife of his own hand. The uncertainty was a physical weight, pressing on his diaphragm. "Mechanics," Thorne repeated. The word tasted like ash. "I'm mechanics." As the guard shifted his weight, his boots scraped against the stone. "Best you get home, for the fog is turning to sleet." Thorne nodded, though the gesture felt automatic, disconnected from his will. He turned away from the wall, the rough brick slipping from his palm. The walk back would be long. The streets would be empty. The spectators retreated to their firesides to digest the day's horror as if it were a hearty meal. He started walking, the sound of his own footsteps now isolated, no longer echoing against the prison walls, but absorbed by the wet cobbles of the street. He did not look back. To look back would be to invite the place to follow him, to let the damp and the despair cling tighter than the mist. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, where the gaslights grew sparser and the shadows deeper. The city stretched out before him, vast and indifferent, swallowing the sounds of his passage. He thought of the 7 dead again, their faces blurring in his mind, merging into a single mask of tragedy. He thought of Williams, alone in the dark. He thought of himself, walking home to a cold study and a blank page. The sleet began, tiny needles of ice stinging his cheeks. He pulled his coat collar up, shielding his neck. The cold bit through the wool, finding the bone. He walked faster, driven by a sudden, irrational fear that if he slowed, the silence of the prison would catch up to him, wrapping around his throat like a garrote. The streets remained empty. No carriages, no peddlers, just the fog and the ice and the sound of one man walking away from the heart of the darkness. He reached the corner of his street and paused, checking the lock of his door before entering. The brass was cold, biting his fingers. He turned the key, the mechanism grinding within, and stepped into the hallway. The darkness inside was absolute, a different kind of void than the one outside. He closed the door, shutting out the sleet, shutting out the prison, shutting out the city. But the silence remained. It waited for him in the study. It waited on the blank page. It waited, heavy and expectant, for the news that would soon arrive on the wind. Dawn did not break, it leaked. A grey, watery seepage oozed through the cracks in the shutters of Thorne's study, turning the dust motes into suspended ash. He had not slept. The chair held the shape of his spine, a hollow carved by hours of staring at a blank ledger where the numbers refused to add up to justice. 7 lives, 1 suspect. And now, the silence from Coldbath Fields felt heavier than the fog pressing against the glass. A hammer fell on the door, 3 sharp cracks that skipped the rhythm of a polite knock. Thorne stood, knees popping, the blood rushing back into legs numb from stillness. He crossed the hall, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and lifted the latch. Constable Miller stood on the step, rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto the threshold. The water pooled around his boots, dark and oily. He did not wipe his feet. His face was the color of wet slate, eyes red-rimmed and avoiding Thorne's gaze. "Mr. Thorne." "Constable." Thorne kept his hand on the door, the wood cold and damp under his palm. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Miller swallowed, the sound loud in the narrow hallway. "Williams." "Has he spoken?" "Dead." The word hung between them, flat and final, stripping the air of oxygen. Thorne felt a sudden, sharp tightening in his chest, not grief, but the reflexive clench of a man who knows a door has just slammed shut forever. "Dead how?" "Found him an hour ago, in the cell." Miller shifted, his shoulder brushing the doorframe, leaving a smear of grime on the paint, throat cut deep from ear to ear. Thorne stepped back, granting entry without a word. Miller moved past him, bringing the smell of the street insidious stale ale, river mud, and the coppery tang of fresh blood that seemed to cling to his wool coat despite the rain. The constable stopped in the center of the room, looking lost, his hat still on his head. "A razor?" Thorne asked, moving towards the fireplace where the embers had long since turned to grey dust. "I hidden in the straw, or maybe given to him, who knows?" Miller laughed, a short, brittle sound that cracked in the middle. "Magistrates are calling it suicide, saying he couldn't face the gallows, that conscience did the work the hangman was meant to do." "Conscience?" Thorne tested the word, rolling it over his tongue like a sour fruit. "A convenient executioner." "It closes the book, sir." Miller's voice dropped, becoming a mutter intended for the floorboards. "Crowds already gathering outside the prison. They want to see the body, want to spit on it, likely." "And you?" Miller looked up then, his eyes meeting Thorne's with a flash of raw, unguarded fear. "I saw the angle of the cut, Mr. Thorne, left to right. Williams was left-handed. Everyone at the docks knew it. But the wound," he trailed off, shaking his head as if to dislodge the image. "It doesn't sit right, like a boot forced onto the wrong foot." Thorne walked to the sideboard, pouring 2 fingers of gin from a decanter that had gathered dust for weeks. He handed the glass to Miller. The constable took it with a trembling hand, the liquid sloshing over the rim onto his knuckles. He did not lick it off. "Drink," Thorne said, "then we go." "Go where?" "To see him before they wash him, before they turn him into a spectacle for the fishwives and the gentry." Thorne reached for his coat, the heavy wool stiff with dampness. "If the book is closed, constable, I intend to read the last page myself." Miller drained the glass in one swallow, wincing as the spirit burned his throat. He set the crystal down on the table with a clink that sounded too loud in the quiet room. "They won't let us linger. The governor's in a panic. Says the mob will tear the place down if they don't produce the corpse soon." "Let them tear it," Thorne said, pulling his coat tight around his thin frame. for while stone and brick do not blade, men do. They stepped out into the street. The sleet had turned to a fine, freezing mist that coated everything in a slick, transparent glaze. The cobbles shone like black mirrors, reflecting the grey sky and the distorted shapes of the buildings. Few people were abroad this early, save for a milk cart clattering towards the market, the horse's breath pluming in great white clouds. The driver stared at them as they passed, his eyes wide, knowing. News in Wapping travelled faster than the plague. Thorne walked briskly, his boots slipping occasionally on the glazed stones. Miller matched his stride, silent now, the gin having steadied his hands but not his nerves. The walk to Coldbath Fields was a journey through a city holding its breath. Shutters were drawn tight against the morning, yet Thorne felt the weight of unseen eyes behind the glass, watching the clerk and the constable march towards the prison where the suspect had joined the victims in death. The gates of the prison loomed ahead, iron bars stark against the gloom. A crowd had indeed begun to gather, a knot of men and women huddled against the wall, their voices a low, hungry murmur. They parted as Thorne and Miller approached, recognizing the authority in Miller's uniform and the grim purpose in Thorne's gait. "Is it true?" a woman called out, her voice shrill with a terrible excitement. "Did he do it to himself?" Miller kept walking, jaw set. Thorne did not answer. To speak would be to feed the beast, to give them a narrative to chew on while the truth rotted in the cell. Inside the courtyard, the air was stagnant, trapped by the high walls and saturated with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp straw. The governor waited by the entrance to the cell block, a portly man wringing his hands in a handkerchief that looked too white for such a place. "Mr. Thorne," the governor said, stepping forward to block the path. "This is highly irregular. The magistrates haven't her." "Move," Thorne said. His voice was quiet, devoid of anger, but it carried a weight that made the governor flinch. "I am not here as a clerk. I am here as a witness." "Witness to what? The man is dead. The matter is concluded." "The matter is concluded for you," Thorne said, stepping around the man. "For me, it begins anew." He pushed open the door to the cell block. The corridor was dim, lit by a single sputtering torch that cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. The silence here was absolute, a physical pressure against the eardrums. At the end of the hall, the door to Williams's cell stood ajar. Thorne stopped at the threshold. Miller moved past him, lifting the lantern higher. The cell was small, the straw on the floor churned into a chaotic mess. In the center lay the body. Williams was on his back, one arm flung out as if reaching for something just out of grasp. The blood had soaked into his shirt, a dark, spreading stain that had stiffened the fabric into a shell. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, clouded and unseeing. On the floor near his right hand lay the razor. It was small, ordinary, the bone handle stained red. Thorne stepped inside, the straw crunching softly under his boots. He looked down at the dead sailor, searching the face for some trace of the man who had walked these streets 12 days ago. He found nothing, just a vessel emptied of life, a puzzle piece forced into a slot where it did not quite fit. He crouched, ignoring the damp seeping through his trousers, and examined the wound. The cut was brutal, jagged in places, suggesting a hand that shook or a blade that was dull, or perhaps a hand that was not the owner's. "Left-handed," Miller whispered behind him, the words hanging in the cold air. Thorne nodded slowly, rising to his feet. His joints ached, a deep, bone-weary pain that had nothing to do with age. He looked at the razor, then at the door, then back at the dead man. "Close it," Thorne said. "So?" "Close the door, let him keep his silence." Thorne turned and walked out of the cell, past the governor, past the crowds gathering at the gates. The mist had thickened, swallowing the world in grey. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone, that the magistrates would declare the case closed before noon. They would hang the body in chains if they could find a beam strong enough. They would sell prints of the scene. They would write pamphlets. But as he stepped out into the yard, he caught Miller's eye. The constable was looking at the razor bagged on the table, his brow furrowed, doubt etched deep into the lines of his face. For a second, their gazes locked, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The case was closed. The truth, however, remained loose, wandering the fog-choked streets of Wapping, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. The razor sat on the wooden trestle, isolated from the rest of the world by a square of oilcloth that had seen better decades. Blood had dried into the hinge, a rusty scab that refused to be wiped away by the damp rag Miller held. It looked innocent enough, a barber's tool, the kind used to shave a chin or trim a beard, yet it carried the weight of 7 grav. Thorne stared at the bone handle, noting how the grain had been worn smooth by a thumb, not a sailor's calloused grip, but something softer, perhaps a man who worked with ropes that frayed rather than tools that cut. Or maybe the wear was old, inherited, a ghost of a previous owner who had never imagined such an end for the instrument. "Found it under the straw," Miller said, his voice cracking on the last syllable. He did not look at Thorne, focusing instead on the way the lantern light caught the dried crimson on the steel. "Right where you saw it, no one moved it." "And the guard? Drunk or asleep?" Miller finally lifted his gaze, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, to claim he heard nothing until the rattle started. "Says the devil came in quiet as a cat." "The devil leaves no footprints, constable. Men do." Thorne reached out, his finger hovering an inch above the blade without touching it. The air in the yard tasted of wet ash and the sour tang of the crowd pressing against the outer gates, a smell that seeped through the stone walls to mix with the stagnation of the prison. He could hear them out there, the murmuring rising in pitch, a collective beast demanding meat, demanding a name to scream at, a body to hang. They did not care about the angle of the cut or the position of the hand. They wanted the story to end so they could go home to their warm fires and tell their children the monster was dead. A heavy boot scraped against the cobblestones behind them. The governor had followed, wiping his hands on that absurdly white handkerchief, his face flushed with the exertion of authority he did not possess. "The magistrates are convening," the governor announced, his voice too loud for the small space, bouncing off the damp walls. "They require the body to be prepared for the coroner, and the razor, evidence must be secured." "Secured for what?" Thorne asked, turning slowly. The movement made his knees pop, a sharp reminder of the cold that had settled deep into his marrow. "The trial is over before it began. You have your culprit. He has obliged you by dying." "It is procedure, Mr. Thorne. We cannot have rumors flying that the evidence was tampered with." The governor stepped forward, reaching for the oilcloth. "The public needs certainty." "Certainty is a luxury we cannot afford." Thorne slapped the governor's hand away, a sharp, stinging sound that silenced the distant murmur of the crowd for a heartbeat. The governor recoiled, clutching his hand to his chest, shock widening his eyes. "Look at the wound again. Really look at it. A man cutting his own throat with his right hand drives the blade left to right, deep under the ear. This cut." Thorne gestured towards the cell door, though the body was hidden now behind the wood. "It starts low. It jagged. It fights the anatomy of a suicide." "He was desperate," the governor snapped, regaining his composure through sheer force of will. "Men do strange things when the noose waits." "Men do, but they also leave signs. A struggle, a dropped blade in the wrong hand, a guard who hears nothing in a stone box." Thorne leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that forced the other 2 men to lean closer to hear, trapping them in his gravity. Or perhaps a man was helped. Perhaps the net was tightening too fast, and someone decided to tie the knot for him. Miller flinched, the lantern swinging in his grip, casting wild shadows that danced across the governor's sweating face. "You speak of conspiracy, sir, in a locked cell." "I speak of what I see." Thorne straightened, his spine cracking in protest. "And what I see is a convenience too perfect to be true. The Mars butchered, the Williamsons slaughtered, and now the suspect, conveniently silenced before he can speak a word of defense or confession." The governor straightened his coat, smoothing the wrinkles with trembling fingers as he declared that the record would show suicide. "The magistrates have already drafted the statement. To suggest otherwise is to invite chaos, for the city is on a knife edge. Thorne, one wrong word and the mob tears this place down." "Let them tear it," Thorne said, the words tasting like bile. "Better chaos than a lie wrapped in law." "It is not a lie if the world accepts it as truth." The governor's voice was flat, devoid of shame, merely stating the mechanics of survival in a city that ate its young. "Bag the razor, Miller. Take it to the clerk's office, lock it away. Miller hesitated. His hand hovered over the oilcloth, fingers twitching. He looked at the governor, then at Thorne, the conflict warring visibly in the set of his jaw. For a moment, the world held still, balanced on the edge of a constable's conscience. Then slowly, Miller folded the corners of the cloth over the blade, hiding the rusted hinge, the dried blood, the terrible simplicity of the tool. He tied the string with a knot that looked too tight, too final. "There," Miller said, his voice rough, "secured." "Good," the governor exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. "Now, if you will excuse me, I must inform the family that they will not be getting their justice in a court of law." He turned and marched towards the gate, his boots clicking sharply on the stones, a retreating rhythm of bureaucratic victory. Thorne watched him go, feeling a profound exhaustion settle over him, heavier than the fog, heavier than the years. He turned to Miller, who still held the bundled razor as if it were a live coal. "You saw it too," Thorne said. "It was not a question." Miller shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking as he spoke. "I saw a dead man, Mr. Thorne. That is all he was paid to see." "Liar." The word hung between them, sharp and brittle. Miller's eyes flickered, a flash of fear quickly masked by a dull resignation. He tucked the bundle under his arm, holding it close to his chest. "The gates are opening. The crowd will be surging soon. You should leave before they decide you are part of the cover-up." Thorne nodded, a slow, stiff movement. He walked towards the archway, the stone cold against his shoulder as he passed. Outside, the roar of the crowd erupted, a physical wave of sound that hit him in the chest. Cheers, jeers, the chanting of a name that was already becoming a legend, a story to be told in taverns for generations. They wanted blood, and they had been given a corpse. It would have to be enough. He stepped into the grey light of the morning, the mist swirling around his ankles like a living thing. Behind him, the heavy iron gates began to grind open, the sound of metal on stone screaming into the sky. Miller stood in the shadow of the archway, watching him go, the bundled razor hidden beneath his coat. Their eyes met one last time, a silent pact sealed in the gloom. The case was closed. The files would be dusted and shelved. The magistrates would pat themselves on the back for restoring order. But as Thorne walked out into the street, merging with the flow of people eager to gawk at the scene of the suicide, he felt the weight of the unsaid pressing against his ribs. The truth was not dead. It was merely waiting, biding its time in the shadows of the cells and the silence of the clerks, a ghost that would haunt the cobbles of Wapping long after the blood had been scrubbed from the stones. He pulled his collar up against the damp, the taste of coal smoke thick on his tongue, and walked into the fog, carrying the knowledge that the real killer was still out there, walking free, perhaps watching the crowd, perhaps smiling. A stone struck the cartwheel with a wet crack, spinning off into the gutter, where a child scrambled to retrieve it before a hobnailed boot could crush his fingers. Thorne stood pressed against the damp brick of a chandler's shop, the rough mortar scraping his shoulder blade through 3 layers of wool, while the river wind shoved the fog low enough to taste the salt and the rot of low-tide mud. The air reeked of bituminous coal smoke, thick and greasy, coating the back of the throat like swallowed soot, but beneath that industrial blanket lay something sharper, the sour tang of unwashed bodies packed too tight in the street, men and women sweating despite the biting chill, their breath pluming in grey clouds that mingled with the mist rising from the Thames. They waited, not for justice, for meat. The cart lurched forward, iron rims groaning against the cobbles, and the crowd surged with it, a single heaving organism driven by a hunger that had nothing to do with bread. There, propped upright against a crate of turnips to ensure visibility, sat John Williams. His head lolled forward, chin resting on a chest stiffened by the cold, the skin a waxy parchment stretched tight over bone, greyish-green where the bruising had begun to bloom beneath the surface. A ragged hole gaped in his waistcoat, the fabric dark and stiff with dried blood that had seeped through to the shirt beneath, a stark, rust-colored stain against the pale linen. He looked small, diminished. The terror of the Ratcliffe Highway reduced to a sack of wet flour waiting to be dumped at the crossroads. "Throw another," a voice shrieked from somewhere near Thorne's elbow, high and brittle with excitement. "Make him feel it, you coward." A handful of mud slapped against Williams's cheek, sliding slowly down the rigid line of his jaw to drip onto his collar. The dead man did not flinch. He offered no defense, no plea, only the hollow stare of eyes that had rolled back slightly in their sockets, catching the dull light of the overcast sky without seeing it. Thorne gripped the lapel of his coat, knuckles white, fighting the urge to step forward and wipe the filth away, to restore some shred of dignity to the corpse of a man who might have been a monster or might have been merely the most convenient target in a city desperate for closure. It did not matter now. The verdict had been delivered not by a judge in a powdered wig, but by the collective roar of 10,000 throats demanding a spectacle. The cart bumped over an uneven patch of stone, jarring the body so that Williams's head snapped back against the wood with a sickening thud that echoed louder than the cheering. A woman near the front laughed, a sharp, barking sound that cut through the murmur of the mob, and she pointed a gloved finger at the swaying corpse, as if indicating a prize pig at market. Beside her, a dockworker wiped his nose on a sleeve stained with tar and spit on the ground, his face twisted in a grimace of triumph that mirrored the very savagery attributed to the sailor. They condemned the brutality of the murders while enacting their own slow, grinding violence upon the remains, blind to the reflection staring back from the puddles in the street. Thorne felt the bile rise, acidic and hot, burning the throat he had tried to keep clear of the smoke. This was the erosion, not the slow wear of water on stone, but the sudden collapse of moral ground beneath the weight of fear. 7 lives extinguished in the dark, their blood soaking into the floorboards of quiet homes, and here the city celebrated the end of the mystery with the enthusiasm of a holiday fair. The distinction between the killer and the crowd blurred, dissolving in the fog until Thorne could no longer tell where the monster ended and the mob began. They fed on the death, consuming it with the same ravenous appetite that had drawn them to the windows of the Marr house, to the silent bedroom of the Williamsons, turning grief into gossip and tragedy into entertainment. "Did you see the cut?" a man shouted, leaning so far over the cart's edge that his hat nearly brushed the dead man's knee. "Clean through the windpipe. That's the work of a devil, I tell you." "Devil's dead now," another roared back, raising a fist that held a half-eaten apple. "Rot in hell, Williams." The apple struck the body, bouncing off the rigid thigh to roll under the wheel, where it was instantly pulverized into pulp. Thorne watched the juice mix with the mud, a streak of pale yellow amidst the brown slurry, and he thought of the apprentice boy, his throat opened with similar precision, his life spilled out onto the shop counter while the city slept. There was no reverence here, no solemnity for the 7 souls who would never feel the sun again. Only the frantic energy of a populace relieved that the boogeyman had been caught, even if the catching required a suicide in a cell and a parade of the corpse through the streets like a captured fox. He shifted his footing, the sole of his boot slipping on a patch of discarded cabbage leaf, and the movement drew the attention of the woman beside him. She glanced at him, her eyes bright with a feverish glow, cheeks flushed red against the grey backdrop of the morning. "You look pale, sir," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried easily over the din. "Queasy, it's the sight of him. Some can't stomach the justice." "I have seen enough blood to fill the Thames," Thorne replied, the words coming out flat, stripped of the anger he felt. "This is not justice, it is a carnival." She blinked, the confusion flickering across her face before being swallowed by a dismissive shrug. "He killed them, he's dead, what more is there?" "The truth," Thorne said, but the wind snatched the word away, carrying it off towards the river where the bells of a passing ship told a muffled, mournful note that seemed to disagree with the cheering. The woman turned back to the cart, losing interest in the thin, grey-haired clerk who lacked the stomach for a good hanging, even a posthumous one. Thorne watched her, then looked back at Williams. The sailor's hand hung over the side of the cart, fingers curled in a permanent claw, the nails blackened with dirt. It was a hand that had held a mallet, perhaps, or a chisel, or perhaps nothing more than a rope in the rigging of a merchantman. The ambiguity of it gnawed at Thorne, a persistent ache behind the eyes that no amount of sleep could cure. The magistrates had their suicide, the governor had his order, the crowd had their villain. But the silence of the dead remained absolute, refusing to confirm or deny the narrative being constructed around its stiffening form. The procession slowed as it approached the junction where the road to the crossroads branched off, the cart wheels sinking slightly into the soft earth of the verge. The cheering intensified, a crescendo of noise that vibrated in the chest, rattling the ribs, drowning out the distant cry of gulls and the lap of water against the pilings. Thorne took a step back, his heel finding the solid curb of the pavement, and then another, retreating from the press of bodies that smelled of ale and unwashed wool. He could not watch the burial. He could not stand by while they shoved the body into the earth at the intersection of 3 roads, marking the spot with a stake and a prayer that felt more like a curse. To stay would be to participate, to witness the final erasure of a man who might have been innocent or guilty or simply broken by the weight of a city's paranoia. He turned his collar up against the wind, pulling the fabric tight around his neck as if to shield himself from the noise, and began to walk away from the procession, moving against the flow of the crowd. Shoulders bumped him, hard and indifferent, voices shouted past his ear, but he kept his gaze fixed on the cobblestones, watching the cracks where weeds pushed through the grime, seeking light in the darkness. Behind him, the roar of the mob swelled, a tidal wave of sound that crashed against the buildings of Wapping, echoing off the brickwork with a distorted resonance that sounded less like human voices and more like the grinding of great stones. The bell tolled again, deeper this time, vibrating through the soles of his boots, a funeral knell for the 7 who lay in their grave and the one who rode in the cart, all of them consumed by the same insatiable machine. Thorne walked on, the taste of coal smoke heavy on his tongue, knowing that the spectacle would not bring them back, that the chains waiting at the crossroads would hold only a corpse, while the true horror remained loose, breathing the same foggy air, watching the parade from the shadows with a smile no one would ever see. Thorne watched her, then looked back at Williams. The sailor's hand hung over the side of the cart, fingers curled in a permanent claw, the nails blackened with dirt and dried blood. It was a hand that had held a mallet, perhaps, or a chisel, or perhaps nothing more than a rope in the rigging of a merchantman during a gale off the Cape. The ambiguity of it gnawed at Thorne, a persistent ache behind the eyes that no amount of sleep could cure, yet the magistrates had their suicide and the governor had his order. The crowd had their villain. "Move it along," a constable shoved past Thorne, the flat of his baton striking the wood of the cart with a hollow crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Keep the pace, don't let them stop." "He's dead already," Thorne said, the words slipping out before he could check them. The constable halted, turning a face flushed with exertion and ale towards the clerk. "Better dead than loose, eh? You want another family sliced open in their beds. You want the butcher back on the street." "I want the truth," Thorne said, but the wind snatched the word away, carrying it off towards the river where the bells of a passing ship told a muffled, mournful note that seemed to disagree with the cheering. The constable spat on the cobbles, a glob of brown phlegm that landed near Thorne's boot, and turned back to the procession. "Truth's in the ground now, keep moving." Thorne stood fixed while the cart lurched forward, the wheels sinking slightly into the soft earth of the verge where the road to the crossroads branched off. The cheering intensified, a crescendo of noise that vibrated in the chest, rattling the ribs, drowning out the distant cry of gulls and the lap of water against the pilings. A boy no older than 10 scrambled under the cart's rear axle to snatch the apple pulp crushed by the wheel, wiping the muddy residue on his trousers before shoving it into his mouth. Hunger and hatred shared the same face here. Thorne saw it in the way the woman beside him licked her lips when a stone struck the corpse's shoulder, in the way the men tightened their grips on their canes as if longing to strike the flesh themselves. This was not justice, it was a mirror. He took a step back, his heel finding the solid curb of the pavement, and then another, retreating from the press of bodies that smelled of ale and unwashed wool and the sweet, cloying scent of decay that began to rise from the cart despite the cold. The air grew thick, pressing against his eardrums, a physical weight that made swallowing difficult. He could not watch the burial. He could not stand by while they shoved the body into the earth at the intersection of 3 roads, marking the spot with a stake and a prayer that felt more like a curse, designed to bind the spirit rather than save it. To stay would be to participate, to witness the final erasure of a man who might have been innocent or guilty or simply broken by the weight of a city's paranoia. "Where you going?" The woman from before caught his sleeve, her fingers digging into the wool of his coat with a grip stronger than her frame suggested. "It's nearly done, the best part." "The best part is over," Thorne said, pulling his arm free. "The rest is just noise." She laughed, a sharp, barking sound that cut through the din. "You're a queer one, sir. Most folks pay to see less than this." "Most folks are asleep," Thorne replied, and he turned his collar up against the wind, pulling the fabric tight around his neck as if to shield himself from the noise. He began to walk away from the procession, moving against the flow of the crowd. Shoulders bumped him, hard and indifferent, voices shouted past his ear, but he kept his gaze fixed on the cobblestones, watching the cracks where weeds pushed through the grime, seeking light in the darkness. A man stumbled into him, reeking of gin, and muttered an apology that sounded like a threat, but Thorne did not stop. He pushed through the press, his breath coming in short white puffs that vanished instantly into the fog. Behind him, the roar of the mob swelled, a tidal wave of sound that crashed against the buildings of Wapping, echoing off the brickwork with a distorted resonance that sounded less like human voices and more like the grinding of great stones. The bell tolled again, deeper this time, vibrating through the soles of his boots, a funeral knell for the 7 who lay in their grave and the 1 who rode in the cart, all of them consumed by the same insatiable machine. Thorne walked on, the taste of coal smoke heavy on his tongue, coating the roof of his mouth with a layer of soot that no amount of water would wash away. He passed a shop window where a new display of morning crepe had been set out, the black fabric stark against the glass, priced for the gentry who wished to signal their grief without touching the dirt of the grave. Commerce waited for no coroner. He reached the corner of Gun Street and paused, leaning a hand against the rough brickwork to steady himself. The wall was cold, damp seeping through the wool of his glove to chill his palm, but he left it there, grounding himself against the sway of the crowd moving behind him. From this distance, the cheering was just a raw, indistinct, and animalistic, lacking the specific cruelty of the individual shouts he had heard near the cart. It was better this way. The blur softened the edges of the horror, turning the specific violence into a general hum of public satisfaction. But Thorne knew better. He knew that the spectacle would not bring them back. He knew that the chains waiting at the crossroads would hold only a corpse while the true horror remained loose, breathing the same foggy air, watching the parade from the shadows with a smile no one would ever see. The 7 souls in the ground required more than a dead sailor. They required a silence that the city refused to grant them, a respect that the mob could not understand. He pushed off the wall and continued walking, the cobblestones slick beneath his feet, heading towards the river where the fog lay thickest. There was no verdict here, only the tide coming in. The fire spat. A glob of molten resin popped from the coal, landing on the hearth rug with a hiss that sounded too much like a dying breath. Elias Thorne did not flinch. He sat in the high-backed chair, the one with the leather cracked along the arms where his own hands had worn it down over 30 years of copying indictments, and watched the black lump smolder until the wool ate the heat. Outside, the wind bullied the sash windows, rattling the panes in their frames, but inside the study the air hung still and heavy, thick with the smell of old paper and the sharp, acrid tang of the burning peat. He reached for the pile of papers on the desk. They lay there in a messy heap, no longer organized by date or witness, just a tangle of ink-stained sheets that documented 12 days of terror. His fingers, stiff from the cold that seemed to have settled permanently in his bones, traced the edge of the top sheet. The ink had dried to a dull gray, the handwriting cramped and hurried, capturing the testimony of a maid who saw nothing but a shadow, the report of a constable who found a mallet, the frantic scribbles of a magistrate demanding a name to feed the crowd. "Garbage," Thorne whispered. The word hung in the room, small and ugly. He picked up the bundle. The paper felt dry and brittle against his palm, rasping like dead skin. For a moment he hesitated, the weight of the documents pressing against his wrist, a physical manifestation of the 7 lives extinguished in the fog. To burn them was to destroy the official record, the only proof that the Mars and the Williamsons had ever drawn breath, that blood had soaked into the floorboards of Ratcliffe Highway. But to keep them was to let the city polish the horror into something palatable, something to be discussed over port and dessert by men who had never smelled the iron reek of a slaughterhouse. His gaze drifted to the small pamphlet lying open beside the inkwell. It was fresh from the press, the pages crisp and white, smelling of new glue and vanity. De Quincey. The title promised an inquiry into murder as one of the fine arts. Thorne had skimmed the opening paragraphs earlier, his stomach tightening as he read the elegant prose that turned the butchery of a family into an aesthetic exercise, a matter of composition and lighting. The author wrote of the sublime, of the artistic merit of the killing, dissecting the tragedy with the cold precision of a surgeon who cares more for the scalpel than the patient. He makes it beautiful, Thorne said to the empty room, his voice cracked, dry as the paper in his hand. A shudder worked its way up his spine, starting at the base of his neck and spreading out to his shoulders, a visceral rejection of the words on the page. It was not the violence that sickened him now. He had seen enough blood in the courts to know its texture, its smell, its finality. It was the transformation. The way the city, led by pens like De Quincey's, was already scrubbing the gore from the cobbles and replacing it with a narrative of intrigue and artistry. The dead were becoming characters in a story, their terror edited for flow, their screams muted to fit the rhythm of an essay. Mrs. Marr, clutching her child, the apprentice, struck down before he could raise a hand, the father, bludgeoned in his own bed. They were not art, they were meat, and the city was hungry. Thorne stood up. The movement was slow, his joints protesting the shift from stillness to action, but he forced himself upright. He walked to the fireplace, the papers clutched in his right hand, and looked down into the grate. The coals glowed with a sullen red heat, pulsing slowly like a dormant heart. The flames licked at the edges of a fresh log, turning the bark to ash in seconds. "It ends here," he muttered. He dropped the bundle into the fire. The papers caught instantly, the dry edges curling black and brown as the flames rushed up to consume them. The heat hit his face, sudden and intense, drying the moisture from his eyes. He watched the ink blur and vanish, the names of the witnesses dissolving into smoke, the details of the mallet and the razor and the blood-stained linens twisting into grey ribbons that spiraled up the chimney. The fire roared, a hungry sound that filled the silence of the study, devouring the official truth. Let the magistrates keep their copies. Let the newspapers print their lies. This pile, his own record of the things he had seen and the questions he could not ask, would not be used to decorate a winter evening's entertainment. The flames died down as quickly as they had flared, leaving only a bed of white ash that trembled in the draught. Thorne stared at the residue. It looked like snow, clean, pure, covering the grime of the hearth, a lie just like the rest of it. The ash would be swept away tomorrow, tossed into the street with the rest of the rubbish, indistinguishable from the soot of the city. That was the fate of the 7 souls. Not memory, not justice, but dust. He turned back to the desk and reached for the candle. The flame was low, the wick drowning in a pool of its own wax, casting long, wavering shadows that danced against the bookshelves. He pinched the wick between his thumb and forefinger, extinguishing the light. Darkness rushed in. It was not the gentle dark of a bedroom at night, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against his eyeballs. The room vanished. The desk, the chair, the pamphlet, the fireplace, all of it swallowed by the void. Only the smell remained. The scent of the coal smoke, sharp and biting, mingled with the lingering odor of the burning paper, but beneath that, deeper and more persistent, was something else. It clung to the back of his throat, a phantom taste that no amount of wine or water could wash away. It was the smell of dried blood, old and stale, woven into the very bricks of the house, seeping through the mortar from the streets outside. Thorne stood still in the blackness, listening to the wind rattle the glass. Somewhere out there, the fog rolled off the Thames, blanketing the highway, hiding the stains that the rain could not scrub clean. The city would sleep tonight. The crowds would disperse, the shops would reopen, the conversation would move on to the next scandal, the next war, the next tragedy to be consumed and discarded. But he would remain here in the dark, holding the weight of the unadorned faces. No art, no sublime. Just 7 people who stopped breathing while the world watched. He took a breath, the air cold and sharp in his lungs, and waited for the morning that would bring nothing new. The smoke hung in the room, a grey ghost refusing to fade, testifying to the lives erased by the December frenzy. The ash settled. White dust coated the blackened grate, a fine powder that looked too clean for what it hid, masking the charred edges of witness statements and the scorched remnants of blood-stained linen descriptions. Thorne watched the last ember die, a red eye blinking shut in the gloom, leaving him alone with the smell of burnt paper and the heavier, older scent that no fire could purge. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, feeling the grit of soot, a tactile reminder of the destruction he had just enacted, yet the act felt hollow, a gesture of defiance performed for an audience of one. "Let them have their art," he whispered, the words hanging in the cold air before dissolving into the silence. He turned from the hearth, his boots scuffing against the floorboards, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet room. The desk waited in the shadows, the pamphlet still lying open where he had left it, its crisp pages glowing faintly in the dying light of the candle he had yet to extinguish. De Quincey's elegant script seemed to mock him from across the room, the phrases about composition and lighting twisting into something grotesque under his gaze. The author spoke of the killer as an artist, a figure of sublime terror who elevated the mundane act of butchery into a spectacle worthy of analysis, of admiration even. Thorne walked back to the chair, the wood groaning under his weight as he sat, his spine curving into the familiar slump of a man who had spent a lifetime bending over ledgers and legal briefs. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and traced the edge of the pamphlet. The paper was smooth, expensive, nothing like the rough, ink-blotted sheets he had just fed to the flames. This was a commodity, packaged and sold to the gentry who would read it by their own warm fires, far removed from the chill of the Ratcliffe Highway and the stench of the open drains. They were not compositions, he said, his voice rough, scraping against the silence like a knife on stone. They were people. The distinction mattered. It mattered more than the magistrates knew, more than the crowd cared to acknowledge in their feverish hunt for suspect. To the city, the deaths of the Mars and the Williamsons were already becoming folklore, a story to be told over port, a thrilling mystery to be dissected in the papers. The blood was drying on the cobbles, literally and figuratively, washed away by the tide and the rain, replaced by a narrative that sanitized the horror. John Williams was dead, hanged by his own hand or by the pressure of a mob that demanded a conclusion, and with his death, the appetite for truth had vanished. Satisfaction had taken its place. Thorne picked up the pamphlet. The weight of it was negligible, a few ounces of rag and ink, yet it felt heavy in his hand, weighted down by the impudence of its premise. He flipped a page, the sound crisp in the stillness, and read a sentence that described the positioning of the bodies as a deliberate artistic choice, a tableau of death designed to evoke fear and awe. His stomach turned, a physical recall that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with moral revulsion. There was no art in the way the apprentice had been struck down, no sublime design in the brain matter splattered across the nursery wall. There was only violence, crude and desperate, leaving behind a mess that no amount of poetic language could tidy up. "Filth," he muttered, dropping the pamphlet back onto the desk. "It is all filth." He leaned back, closing his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids offered no refuge. Images flashed, unbidden and sharp, the wide, staring eyes of Mrs. Marr, the small hand of the child, the brutal angle of the father's head. These were not characters in a story. They were flesh and bone, terrified and confused in their final moments, stripped of dignity by a killer who cared nothing for aesthetics and by a city that cared nothing for them. The essay sought to elevate the murderer, to give him a stature he did not deserve, while the victims were reduced to props in a theatrical production of terror. Thorne opened his eyes. The candle flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the walls like grasping fingers. He watched the wax pool around the wick, the liquid white hardening into ridges as it cooled. Time was moving on, indifferent to his grief, indifferent to the 7 grave that now marked the earth in Wapping. Tomorrow the shops would open. The carts would rumble over the cobbles. The river would rise and fall with the tide. Life would resume its rhythm, grinding forward, with a relentless momentum that left no room for lingering sorrow. "And I am the only one who remembers," he said, the realization settling over him like a wet coat. It was a lonely burden, this duty to hold the true shape of the tragedy in his mind while the world reshaped it into something palatable. He thought of the magistrates, relieved that the case was closed, eager to move on to the next crisis. He thought of the crowd, satisfied that justice had been served, however prematurely. They wanted a villain, not a mystery. They wanted an end, not a truth. And so they accepted the suicide of John Williams as a confession, ignoring the gaps in the evidence, the questions that remained unanswered, the possibility that the real killer walked free, perhaps even laughing at the frenzy he had ignited. Thorne reached for the candle. His hand hovered over the flame, feeling the heat radiating against his skin, a sharp, biting warmth. He could leave it burning. He could sit here all night, guarding the memory of the dead against the encroaching forgetfulness of the city. But the darkness was coming regardless. The candle was dying, just as the day had died, just as the lives of the 7 had been snuffed out in the space of a few violent minutes. "No more light," he said. He pinched the wick. The flame died with a hiss, a tiny plume of grey smoke curling up into the air before dissipating. Darkness rushed in, absolute and heavy, swallowing the room, the desk, the pamphlet, the man. Thorne sat in the void, his eyes open but seeing nothing, his body still but his mind racing. The smell of the burnt paper lingered, mixing with the damp wool of his coat and the underlying, pervasive scent of the river. But beneath it all, deeper than the smoke or the damp, was the smell of blood. It was not fresh, it was old, dried into the cracks of the floorboards, soaked into the mortar of the walls, woven into the very fabric of the house. It was the scent of the December frenzy, a stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He breathed it in, the air cold and sharp in his lungs, filling him with a clarity that was almost painful. This was the truth, not the elegant prose of De Quincey, not the swift justice of the magistrates, not the satisfied roar of the mob. The truth was this darkness, this silence, this smell of old blood that clung to the back of the throat. It was the weight of 7 souls who had been erased, their stories truncated, their deaths commodified. Thorne did not move. He sat in the blackness, a sentinel in a tomb of his own making, holding the line against the forgetfulness that threatened to wash everything away. Let the city have its art. Let them have their stories and their spectacles. He would keep the rest. He would keep the faces, the fear, the raw and ugly reality of what had happened on the Ratcliffe Highway. He would keep it until he too was gone, until his own memory was extinguished like the candle flame. The wind rattled the windowpane, a skeletal tapping that echoed in the quiet room. Outside, the fog rolled off the Thames, thick and impenetrable, hiding the streets, the river, the Grave. It covered everything in a shroud of grey, blurring the lines between the living and the dead, between the truth and the lie. But in here, in the dark, the lines were clear. Thorne knew what had happened. He knew who had died. And he knew that no amount of art could ever make it beautiful. He waited for the morning, knowing it would bring no relief, no answers, no justice. It would only bring the light that allowed the city to pretend again, to paint over the blood with fresh coats of whitewash, and to pretend that the horror was over. But he knew better. The horror was not over. It was just beginning to settle in, to take root in the bricks and the bones of the place, to become a part of the landscape itself. The smoke hung in the room, a grey ghost refusing to fade, testifying to the lives erased by the December frenzy, and Thorne sat within it, the sole keeper of the unadorned dead. The aesthetic of blood is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Old stories retold, Internet Archive. A very British murder, the story of a national obsession, Internet Archive. Ratcliffe Highway murders. On murder considered as one of the fine arts. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.